5:52 p.m. Linda Chioma had the mattress rolled tight against her shoulder, held there by both arms locked across her chest, walking Ashgrove Avenue one storefront at a time. No cart, no help. Every 50 feet she stopped, shifted the weight to the other side, kept walking. Beside her, Maya carried her own backpack and a second bag stuffed with what wouldn't fit anywhere else, her sneakers scuffing the pavement in a rhythm that matched her mother's steps exactly, like she'd learned not to fall behind. A block back, a black sedan slowed to a crawl. The man in the rear seat wasn't looking at the woman. He was looking past her, at a building number bolted to old brick. He knew that number. He'd have known it blind. 20 minutes earlier, Lee Jae-young had been 3 sentences from closing a hospitality acquisition worth more than the entire block Linda was walking down. His attorney's voice came steady through the car speaker, laying out escrow terms while Jae-young watched the city slide past the tinted glass, the kind of glass that made the world outside look softer than it was, quieter than it was, someone else's problem. He answered in clipped, exact sentences. He always did. It was how he'd built everything he had, never letting anyone hear the gap between what he said and what he was thinking. Then he saw the address. "Stop the car," he said, and his attorney kept talking for a full 3 seconds before realizing no one was listening anymore. He stepped out into the heat in a suit that cost more than Linda would clear in 2 months, watching a woman he'd never met walk toward a building he'd spent 6 years trying to forget existed. She didn't know what that brownstone was sitting on top of. She couldn't have known. The auction listing hadn't mentioned it. The city records had buried it, and the men who used to guard that secret were mostly dead or hiding now, same as him. But someone else knew, and they'd been waiting for someone to lead them back to it. Subscribe if you want to be there when Jae-young decides what he's willing to burn down to protect a family that has no idea what they just walked into. And drop a comment telling me what time zone you're reading this in. I want to know how far this story's traveling. Linda didn't look back at the black car. She didn't know it existed. Her whole world in that moment was 50 feet of sidewalk at a time, the mattress digging a groove into her shoulder that would still be there tomorrow, and Maya's small feet keeping pace beside her, like she'd made a private decision not to complain. Jae-young stood on the curb a beat too long. His attorney's voice was still coming through the phone in his hand, tinny and forgotten, still talking about escrow and closing dates, as if the world hadn't just narrowed to a single address 2 blocks up. He ended the call without saying goodbye. His driver, Suho, leaned out the window and asked if everything was all right, and Jae-young said nothing, because he didn't have an answer that would have made sense to anyone who hadn't grown up in the back room of that particular building. He told Suho to keep the car close but hang back, and then he did something he hadn't done in longer than he wanted to admit. He started walking, on foot, in dress shoes not built for it, keeping enough distance that Linda wouldn't clock him as anything but another man heading somewhere on a warm afternoon. He watched her stop at the corner of Ashgrove and 9th, resettle the mattress against her shoulder, glance down at Maya to check she was still there, still fine, still keeping up. There was something in the checking, quick, automatic, done 100 times before, that told him everything about the kind of week she'd had. He knew the building before she reached it. He'd known it the second the sedan slowed. 3 stories of tired brick, a stoop with a wrought iron rail rusted at the joints, a bay window on the 2nd floor boarded from the inside rather than the outside, which told anyone who knew to look that somebody had wanted the dark more than they'd wanted the world seeing in. He'd spent nights in that building as a teenager, doing things he'd since paid a great deal of money and effort to make sure never surfaced in a background check. He knew where the floorboards gave. He knew which wall in the basement wasn't load-bearing, because it had never been a wall at all, just a face poured over something else. He watched Linda climb the stoop, drop the mattress against the door with a grunt that carried down the block, and dig a key out of her jacket pocket. A key, not a crowbar, not a locksmith's tool, Not the movements of someone breaking into a building they had no right to. A key, turned in a lock she owned. That was the part that made his stomach drop in a way the syndicate's name never had. She wasn't a stranger who'd wandered onto a piece of land better left forgotten. She was the owner. Which meant somewhere in a city records office, a distress auction had quietly sold off a building his old crew had spent 2 decades making sure never came up for sale, and nobody currently living in his world had noticed, until a woman with a rolled mattress walked through its front door. He stood across the street for 11 minutes after the door closed behind her, doing math he didn't like the answer to. The brownstone had been dark for 6 years, tied up first in probate after the last name on the deed died with no next of kin anyone could produce. Then, in a chain of shell holding companies his former partners had built specifically to keep it off anyone's radar, including, eventually, his own. He'd stopped tracking it around the time he'd stopped being anyone's partner. He'd assumed, the way you assume about a wound you've stopped checking, that it had healed itself into irrelevance. Buildings like that were supposed to rot quietly. They weren't supposed to end up in a city distress sale with a single mother's name on the deed and a 6-year-old carrying a trash bag full of stuffed animals through the front door. He called Suho over, told him to bring the car around to the mouth of the alley behind the block, and stood on the sidewalk a moment longer, looking up at that boarded second-floor window like it might tell him something. It didn't. It never had. It had only ever kept its mouth shut, the way everything from that part of his life had been built to do. Inside, the brownstone smelled like dust and old paint, and something faintly mineral underneath it, the way basements smell when water has been finding its way in for a long time without anyone caring. Linda stood in the front hallway with the mattress propped against the wall and let herself breathe for the first time since 2 p.m., when a man in a city vest had taped a notice to her old apartment door and told her, not unkindly, that she had 4 hours. "Is this it?" Maya asked, setting her trash bag down carefully, like the stuffed animals inside might bruise. "Is this our new house?" "This is our new house," Linda said, and made her voice sound sure of it, because 6-year-olds could hear the difference between a fact and a hope, and she needed this to sound like a fact, even though she'd seen the building exactly twice before today, once in a grainy listing photo, once from the sidewalk the week she'd put in the winning bid, both times with her stomach doing something complicated about the price and what it meant that a whole building in this city could go for that little. She hadn't asked why. City distress sales rarely came with a why. A property fell through enough legal cracks, sat unclaimed and untaxed long enough, and eventually the city just wanted it off the books, wanted somebody, anybody, paying property tax on it again. She'd had $11,000 saved from 4 years of double shifts and a settlement from her old landlord that her lawyer said was fair and she knew was insulting, and she'd used every cent of it on a building nobody else in the auction room had wanted. Now she understood the silence in that room a little better. Nobody had wanted it because it looked like this: water damage feathering down one wall in the shape of a continent, a kitchen with cabinets hanging by single hinges, a smell she couldn't place and didn't like. But it had 4 walls and a roof, and her name on the deed, and after 4 hours' notice to vacate an apartment she'd lived in for 3 years, 4 walls and a roof, and her name on something was worth more to her than granite countertops. She walked the ground floor room by room, while Maya trailed behind, narrating everything she found, like a tiny real estate agent. "This can be the reading room. This closet is the size of my old room." And Linda let her have that, let her make it sound like an adventure instead of what it actually was, because that was the whole job right now, making the fall look like flying, for as long as she could manage it. She didn't notice, in the front hallway, that one of the floorboards sat a half-inch higher than the ones around it, the wood underneath a slightly different grain than the boards on either side. She didn't notice. In the basement she didn't go down to that first night, because the stairs looked unsafe, and she was too tired to test them, that the far wall was 11 inches thicker than a wall built simply to hold up a house had any reason to be. She had a mattress to unroll, and a daughter to feed, and a night to get through, and the building kept its secrets the same easy way it always had, by simply outwaiting whoever was standing in it. 4 hours' notice. That was the number that kept surfacing in Linda's mind while she lay on the bare mattress that night, with Maya's back pressed against her side, both of them still in their day clothes, because she hadn't unpacked the sheets yet, hadn't unpacked anything yet, had just gotten the mattress off the floor and onto nothing really, just the floor, but at least off the actual ground. 4 hours. She'd lived in that apartment on Cortelu for 3 years, paid on time, every time, even the 2 months after Maya's father left, when on time meant a payment plan and a lot of ramen. She'd known the building was being sold. Everyone on the block had known. There'd been men in hard hats measuring things for a month, but the paperwork she'd been shown said 90 days. 90 days to relocate, standard notice, the kind of timeline that let a person breathe, make calls, find somewhere that would take a security voucher and a 6-year-old. Then a different notice had appeared on her door on a Tuesday, citing an emergency structural determination she'd never been told about, no inspection she'd witnessed, no hearing she'd been invited to. 4 hours. A number she now understood with the particular clarity of someone lying on a bare mattress at midnight, that made no sense for a structural emergency and perfect sense for something else, for a building that needed to be empty fast, cleared out before anyone asked too many questions about who was doing the clearing and why. She hadn't had the bandwidth to chase the why. She'd had 4 hours and a daughter, and a storage unit she couldn't afford, and so she'd done the only math available to her. What fit in a car? What didn't? What could be carried on a body if it came to that? It had come to that. The mattress had been the only thing she couldn't leave. Maya had nightmares on unfamiliar surfaces, had for a year now, and Linda would rather dislocate a shoulder than add a bad mattress to everything else she was asking her daughter to absorb without complaint. What she didn't know, what nobody had bothered to tell the tenants of that block, because nobody ever did, was that the emergency structural determination had been requested by a shell entity 3 layers removed from a development firm that had spent 18 months quietly buying up every property adjacent to a certain brownstone at the end of Ashgrove Avenue, waiting for the right administrative lever to clear the block fast and clean, tenants displaced under color of safety rather than eminent domain. No hearings, no press, no time for anyone to ask questions about why a structural inspector had signed off on an emergency with no inspection report attached. Linda had been evicted not because anyone cared where she lived. She'd been evicted because her old building sat close enough to the brownstone that a fast, forceful clearing of the block made it easier for somebody to search a building nobody currently living remembered the true value of. She was collateral in a hunt she didn't know existed, for a vault she didn't know she now legally owned. She fell asleep before she could finish being angry about the 4 hours, which was its own kind of mercy. Jae-hyun didn't sleep at all. He sat in his home office at 2 a.m. with 3 monitors running and a bottle of water he hadn't touched, going through records he'd told himself for years he'd never need to open again. The syndicate, what remained of it, scattered now into legitimate businesses and buried identities, and, in a few cases, prison sentences under different names, had kept meticulous records back when it mattered, the kind of paranoid documentation men keep when they don't trust each other enough to rely on memory. Jae-hyun had inherited copies of a fraction of it when he'd bought his way out, insurance he'd never had to use. He used it now. The brownstone showed up in 3 separate ledgers under 3 separate code names, which told him immediately how much it had mattered to the people who'd built that basement wall. The vault behind it. He still thought of it as the vault, even now, even though the word felt almost embarrassing, like something out of the kind of movie his old associates had actually watched too much of, hadn't been touched since before he'd left the organization. Whatever was in it, whoever had put it there, had considered it valuable enough to encase it in 11 inches of reinforced concrete, and then simply wait, for years, for a moment that never seemed to come, until now. Because scattered through the encrypted files, layered under enough redirects and dead-end shells that it had taken him 4 hours to find, was a search, recently, methodical. Someone was pulling property records for the entire Ashgrove block, cross-referencing them against a set of old syndicate coordinates that should have died with the men who'd known them. Someone was rebuilding a map Jae-hyun had thought erased. He recognized 2 of the digital fingerprints in the search pattern. Both belonged to men who used to answer to the same person he used to answer to. Men who'd taken the syndicate's collapse not as an ending but as a reorganization. Men who were, according to the last intelligence he had, currently operating under the very corporate rivals circling his own hospitality acquisition. The same firm whose lawyers had been on the phone with his that afternoon while he sat in traffic and watched a woman carry a mattress toward the one building on Earth he'd hoped to never think about again. It wasn't a coincidence. Jae-hyun didn't believe in those, not in this world. Someone inside his own merger negotiations had access to information that pointed straight at the brownstone, and someone had used administrative muscle, the kind that could manufacture a 4-hour eviction notice out of nothing, to clear the block fast enough to search it without an audience. They hadn't found what they were looking for yet. If they had, Linda would already be gone from that building, one way or another, and the sale would never have gone to public auction at all, which meant they'd lost the trail somewhere, lost track of exactly which structure on the block held the vault, and the city's distress sale had put a stranger with a 6-year-old directly on top of it before anyone with the old knowledge could stop it. He closed the laptop at 4 a.m. with a decision half made and unpleasant. He couldn't walk in as who he actually was. Lee Jae-hyun, CEO, 31 years old, name on record, with 2 syndicate factions that would very much like to know what he currently knew and what he intended to do about it. But he couldn't do nothing either, not with a child sleeping in that building and men who used to be his colleagues rebuilding a map that ended at her front door. He'd need a different name for this, a different reason to be standing on that stoop. The knock came at 10 a.m., 3 sharp raps that Linda answered while still holding a rag, halfway through wiping down a kitchen counter that seemed determined to stay grimy no matter what she did to it. The man on the stoop wore a gray suit instead of black, a lanyard around his neck with a laminated badge that read, City Structural Assessment, Supplemental Review, and an expression of mild professional patience that gave away absolutely nothing about the 4 hours of research and one very carefully constructed cover identity behind it. Miss Chioma, he said, I'm sorry to bother you so soon after purchase. My name is Yong Lee. He'd flipped his own name, first for last, a habit from a life that had trained him always to leave himself a door he could walk back out of. There was a supplemental inspection flagged during the distress sale process. Nothing urgent, just a follow-up the county requires before the property fully clears title. Structural, mostly. Foundation, load-bearing walls. Shouldn't take more than half an hour. It was, Linda would think later, a strange kind of luck that the one government-adjacent visit she got in her first week in this building was one that actually seemed to want to help, rather than take something. She didn't love strangers walking her house so soon after she'd moved in. And something about him, the stillness in how he stood, the way his eyes moved across the hallway like he was reading a room instead of just looking at it, made the back of her neck prickle in a way she couldn't name. But he had a badge and a clipboard, and city inspections had been the thing that ended her lease with 4 hours' notice, which meant the smartest move available to a woman with no lawyer and no time, was to cooperate fast and get it over with. "Half an hour," she repeated, stepping back to let him in. "I've got a 6-year-old somewhere in here, so—" "I'll be careful," he said, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the reason she thought. He moved through the ground floor slower than a real inspector would have, cataloging things a real inspector wouldn't care about. The height of the front hallway floorboard, the slight variance in wall thickness he could feel with his palm more than see with his eyes, the particular quality of the quiet that basements like this one held when something inside them had been undisturbed for a very long time. Linda trailed a few steps behind, arms crossed, watching him with the wary attention of someone whose trust in official-looking men had been recently and thoroughly spent. "You bought at a distress auction," he said, not quite a question, standing at the top of the basement stairs and looking down into the dark with an expression she couldn't read. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's just unusual. Most people who understand what these buildings actually cost to bring up to code stay away from them." He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his face shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated, like he was revising a number he'd had wrong. "You didn't know what you were buying, did you?" "I bought a roof," Linda said, and there was an edge in it now, tired and defensive in equal measure. "For me and my daughter. That's what I knew I was buying. If there's a problem with the foundation, just tell me the number, and I'll figure it out. Same as I've figured out everything else this week." Jae-hyun stood there a moment longer than the moment required, aware of Maya's voice drifting down from the second floor, aware of the 11 inches of concrete somewhere beneath his feet, and the 2 digital fingerprints closing in on this address, from somewhere out in the city, aware that the woman in front of him had no idea she was standing at the center of something that had already gotten one child's father chased out of the country and had cost at least 3 men their lives back when Jae-hyun still went by a name that mattered in rooms like the one hidden in this basement. "There's no problem with the foundation," he said finally, which was true in the way that mattered least, and untrue in the way that mattered most. "I'll have my full report to the city by the end of the week. In the meantime," he hesitated, close to saying more than a supplemental inspector had any business saying, "keep your doors locked at night. In old blocks like this, more activity around here lately than there should be." He left before she could ask him what that meant, walked back to where Suho was waiting 2 streets over, and sat in the back of the sedan with his jaw tight, running the same calculation over and over, without landing anywhere he liked. He could tell her the truth and put a target directly on her back the moment anyone learned she knew, or he could keep her in the dark and hope his own resources moved faster than the men currently rebuilding a map that ended, unmistakably now, at her front door. Behind him, on the second floor of the brownstone, Maya pressed her face to the boarded-up bay window, found a gap between 2 planks just wide enough to see through, and watched the black car pull away down the block. The same black car, though she had no way of knowing that yet, that had slowed on the sidewalk the day her mother carried the mattress home. Comment below and tell me, do you think Linda should be told the truth now, or is Jae-hyun right to protect her a little longer? I'll be reading every single one before the next chapters go up. The alley behind Ashgrove ran narrow between the brownstone's back fence and the service road, mostly forgotten by anyone who didn't live on the block, exactly the kind of place Jae-hyun would have chosen himself if he'd needed to watch a building without being seen watching it. Which was, he understood within 4 seconds of turning into it, 2 nights after his visit as a city inspector, exactly what someone else had already chosen it for. The van was unmarked, parked at an angle that gave a clean sightline to the brownstone's back door and the boarded bay window above it, positioned close enough to matter and far enough to look incidental to anyone not trained to notice these things. Jae-hyun was trained to notice these things. He'd spent a decade of his life learning exactly how a surveillance position was supposed to look when it was done by people who didn't want to be found. And this was that, down to the tinted rear windows and the absence of any plate registered to a name that led anywhere real. He didn't approach it. He walked past at an ordinary pace, phone to his ear, saying nothing to no one, and let his eyes do the only work that mattered. 2 men inside, maybe 3. A thin cable running from the van's rear toward the fence line, a directional mic, or close to it, angled at the house. Whoever had sent them wasn't guessing anymore. They'd narrowed the search from a block to a building, and now they were listening, waiting for the family inside to say something, do something, lead them to whatever they still didn't know how to find without help. He recognized the posture of the man in the driver's seat before he recognized the face, and when he did place it, a name from a decade ago, a face that had aged the way faces age when a person spends their life expecting to be found by someone worse than they are, his stomach dropped in the specific way it only ever did, around people who'd once called him by his real name, in rooms where lying could get you killed. Cho Dae-hyun, former mid-tier enforcer, the kind of man who never rose high enough to matter in decision-making, but rose exactly high enough to be trusted with the details that mattered most. Which buildings, which walls, which floorboards. If Dae-hyun was sitting in a van behind Linda's house, it meant the rival faction hadn't just guessed their way here. It meant someone with real memory of the old operation was walking them through it, piece by piece, and that kind of guide didn't stop until the job was finished. Jae-young kept walking until he was 3 blocks clear, then called Suho and told him, in a voice flatter than he felt, to bring the car. He had maybe 2 days before surveillance turned into something worse. He needed the vault emptied, the woman moved, and the whole rotten history of that basement wall settled, and he needed all 3 of those things to happen without anyone in that van realizing he was the one doing it. Linda found the loose floorboard on a Tuesday, not because she was looking for anything, but because Maya had dropped a hair clip through a gap in the hallway runner and gone hunting for it on hands and knees, the way 6-year-olds hunt for things, with more enthusiasm than method. "Mommy, this one moves," Maya announced, pressing her palm flat against a board that Linda had walked over 100 times that week, without a second thought. It gave, just slightly, a half-inch of play that the boards on either side of it didn't have. Linda knelt down and worked her fingers into the seam, more out of curiosity than anything else. An old building had old surprises. She'd learned that fast, mostly plumbing surprises, and one memorable colony of something she didn't want to think about in the kitchen wall. The board lifted with a small groan, and underneath it, in a shallow recess cut clean and deliberate into the joist below, sat nothing. Just space. A cavity built for something that wasn't there anymore, dust undisturbed in its corners, in a way that told her nothing had been in it for a very long time, if anything ever had. "What's it for?" Maya asked, peering into the gap with the frank curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that some questions made adults uneasy. "I don't know, baby," Linda said, and she didn't. Not really, though something about the careful edges of the cut, too clean for a hiding spot a previous tenant had carved out with a pocket knife, too deliberate to be structural, sat wrong in her chest in a way she couldn't name. She thought of the inspector. Keep your doors locked at night. Old blocks like this. She'd told herself all week that it was just something a cautious man said to a woman living alone with a child. Boilerplate concern, nothing more. But she found herself, that afternoon, running her hands along the hallway walls, the way Maya had run her hands along the floor. Testing, tapping, listening for the places where the sound came back different. The basement wall answered her first. She'd finally gone down there 2 days earlier, flashlight in hand, mostly to check for the leak she suspected was behind the water stain upstairs. And she'd noticed even then, in the unfocused way you notice something before you let yourself think about it, that the far wall didn't sound the way a poured foundation wall should sound. She went down again now, Maya trailing behind with the flashlight held in both hands like a torch, and knocked her knuckles along the concrete from one end to the other. Hollow in the middle, solid at both ends. That's weird, right? Maya said, because 6-year-olds could hear things adults tried to explain away, and Linda didn't have a good enough lie ready to tell her it wasn't. It's weird, Linda agreed, and stood there a long moment in the basement dark, feeling for the first time since she'd signed the auction paperwork that she'd bought something with a shape she hadn't been told about. Jae-hyun worked from his home office through that night, and most of the next day, building what he needed, with the particular efficiency of a man who'd learned long ago that moving fast and moving quietly were not the same skill, and both were required here. He couldn't call in security from his own company, too traceable, too easily connected back to a CEO with no legitimate reason to be running protection on a residential property, 2 boroughs from any of his developments. He couldn't call the police, not with a hollow vault under that basement and 2 decades of buried history that a police report would drag straight back up into daylight, taking his entire legitimate life down with it. What he had instead was money, and the kind of quiet contacts money could still buy, when deployed by someone who understood exactly how much not to ask for. He hired 3 men through a security firm, 2 shells removed from his own name, told them only that a residential property needed discreet overnight coverage, gave them a radius to hold, and nothing to explain. He had Suho run a second, tighter perimeter himself, a man Jae-hyun trusted with more than money. And he sat with a floor plan he'd reconstructed from memory, and an old ledger, marking the vault's true dimensions against what he'd seen of the house, trying to calculate how much time he actually had before Dae-hyun's van stopped watching and started moving. Not much, he decided. Surveillance that patient, that funded, didn't sit still for long once it had a confirmed target. He gave it 2 nights. He was wrong by 1. The sound that woke Linda wasn't loud. That was the part that stayed with her longest afterward. How quiet it was. A soft give of wood at the back door, barely audible over Maya's steady breathing beside her. The kind of sound a house makes on its own, except that this one repeated, twice, evenly spaced, deliberate in a way the house's ordinary settling never was. She was up before she'd fully decided to be, phone in one hand, Maya's wrist in the other, moving them both toward the stairs on feet that knew to be silent, even when her heart wasn't. Voices reached her from the ground floor before she reached the second-floor landing, low, clipped, unhurried in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. Men who moved through a house they didn't own, like they had every right to be there. She got Maya into the smallest of the upstairs rooms, the one with the boarded bay window, and pressed her into the closet with a whispered instruction to stay no matter what she heard, stay until Mommy came back for her. Maya's eyes were huge and silent and trusting in the dark, and Linda closed the closet door on that trust and hated, more than she'd hated anything in years, that she had nothing in her hands but a phone with 1 bar of signal and a body between her daughter and whatever was climbing her stairs. She dialed the only number in her recent calls that belonged to someone who'd told her, unprompted, to keep her doors locked at night. The inspector's card, still sitting on her kitchen counter, a number she'd saved on instinct without knowing why. Downstairs, a flashlight beam swept the front hallway floorboards, found the one with the half-inch of give, and a voice said something short and satisfied, in a language Linda didn't speak, but understood the tone of anyway. Jae-hyun was 2 minutes from the block when Linda's call came through, already moving because Suho's perimeter had caught the van's doors opening 9 minutes earlier and radioed it straight to him, already running calculations that had nothing to do with mergers or acquisitions or anything he'd built his adult life to look like. He answered with her name, no greeting, and told her exactly 4 things in the space of 10 seconds. Stay upstairs, stay with Maya, don't come down for any reason, help is less than 3 minutes out. And then he was out of the car before Suho had fully stopped it, moving toward the brownstone's front door with a calm he did not feel anywhere beneath his sternum. The 2 men in the hallway hadn't gotten the floorboard up yet when he came through the door. No forced entry required. A spare key he'd had cut during his first visit. Insurance he'd hoped he'd never use. Jae-hyun turned first, recognition landing on his face in 2 stages. First a stranger, then, unmistakably, someone he used to call by rank instead of name. "You're supposed to be legitimate now," Jae-hyun said, and there was something almost like betrayal in it, the particular bitterness of a man who'd stayed in the life while someone else had bought their way out. "I am," Jae-hyun said. "This is me, protecting an investment." It wasn't true, or it was true in a shape neither of them had a word for yet, and it didn't matter, because Jae-hyun was already reaching for the pry bar leaning against the wall, and the second man was already moving toward the stairs, toward the sound of a 6-year-old's breathing 2 floors up, and Jae-hyun stopped thinking about words at all. What happened over the next 4 minutes was not elegant. It was not the kind of confrontation that photographed well or made for a clean story. It was 2 men who used to work for the same organization, finding out the hard way that leaving didn't mean forgetting how. Jae-young putting his whole weight into stopping the second man 3 steps up the staircase, taking a fist to the jaw that would bruise for a week, driving the man back down into the front hall by main force, and the simple fact that he had more to lose in that stairwell than either of them did. Suho came through the door 40 seconds later, with 2 of the men Jae-young had hired standing behind him, and the math in the room changed fast after that. 4 against 2, and men paid to be discreet were not men who hesitated once discretion had already failed. It ended with Jae-hyun on his knees in the front hallway, the pry bar out of his hands, breathing hard, looking up at Jae-young with an expression that had given up on threats and moved straight to calculation. "You think this ends because we're on the floor tonight," he said. "There's a list above me that doesn't care about 1 building anymore. They know it's here. They'll keep coming. Not for this," Jae-young said, and meant it, because somewhere in the 4 minutes of fighting, he'd already decided what came next, the only version of this that actually ended it, instead of postponing it. "Tell whoever sent you the vault's being emptied, and the site's being sold. There's nothing here worth coming back for." He let Jae-hyun leave under his own power, which was its own kind of message, the kind that traveled faster and further than any threat could, that Jae-young was handling it personally, that the debt he'd spent 6 years avoiding was finally being paid on his own terms. Upstairs, in a closet with the door still closed, Maya sat with her knees pulled to her chest and her mother's arms around her, having heard everything and understood almost none of it, except the one part that mattered. The sounds had stopped, and her mother's heartbeat against her ear had slowed from a drumline back down into something steady. The vault took 2 days to open properly. Once Jae-young brought in people he trusted absolutely, people whose silence he'd bought decades in advance, rather than by the hour. What was behind that 11 inches of concrete turned out to be smaller than its legend. Ledgers, mostly. Records of exactly the kind that had made 3 separate criminal organizations willing to kill over an empty brownstone for years after any money worth stealing had already moved through and out. Paper. Names. The kind of history that was dangerous specifically because it still existed, not because it was worth anything to hold. Jae-young had it removed in a single night and handled the way such things needed to be handled. Some of it destroyed. Some of it turned over through channels that would let old debts finally close without his own name surfacing anywhere in the process. By the end of the week, the address that had mattered so much to so many dangerous people for 6 years mattered to exactly no one anymore. which was the only kind of ending that ever really worked in his old world. Not a victory announced, just a threat, quietly starved of its reason to exist. What he did next, he did as himself. He sat across from Linda at her own kitchen table, patched now, the water damage addressed, a contractor's crew he'd quietly funded, having spent 4 days doing structural work Linda had been told was part of the city's supplemental inspection resolution, a lie generous enough that she'd stopped questioning it by day 2. He told her the truth in pieces, as much as he could afford to and a little more than he probably should have, about a building with a history, about danger that had genuinely existed and was, as of this week, genuinely gone. He didn't tell her everything. He told her enough. Why? Linda asked. Not angry, just tired in the specific way of someone who'd spent a month absorbing more than any one person should have to. Would you do any of this for a stranger? Jae-hyun thought about the answer for longer than the question probably deserved. Because you were carrying a mattress alone, down a street that owed you better than that, he said finally, and nobody stopped to help you. I could stop that, so I did. He couldn't give her the whole truth of why that mattered to him, the years of building a life specifically, so no one would ever again see him as the boy who'd grown up in that building's back rooms, the particular ache of watching someone else inherit his old ghosts without asking for them. But he gave her the deed, fully cleared, every encumbrance and lien and shadow claim resolved through lawyers who never once had to explain what they were actually clearing. He gave her a foundation that was finally just a foundation, walls that were finally just walls, and a floorboard in the front hallway that, when Maya lifted it one last time out of habit, revealed nothing underneath but ordinary dark, empty and unremarkable, and, for the first time since Linda had bought the place, entirely safe. Comment below with the one word you'd use to describe how you want this story to keep going after this. Happy, slow burn, chaos, whatever comes to mind, and I'll pick my favorites to shape what comes next.